In 1986, a 17-year-old boy vanished from his rural home. A disappearance police quickly dismissed as a runaway. For 27 years, his sister lived with the silence, haunted by the quiet, reclusive neighbor next door. She never knew how right her instincts were. When a new family bought the neighbor's property and tore down an old, abandoned sheep pen, they found a trapdoor and unleashed a secret of unimaginable horror. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. We're in this together. Now, let me tell you what really happened. The last good thing Damien Cross would ever create was a picture of his sister laughing. Under the blood-red glow of the darkroom safe light, Cynthia's face emerged from the chemical bath. A perfect moment he didn't know was final. He judged the print his best yet, unaware that the scent of fixer clinging to his skin would be the last familiar smell of his old life. He was focused on capturing a memory, never suspecting he was about to become one. Damien, at the precipice of manhood, was an observer by nature and by craft. His 35mm camera, a weighty, cherished gift from his father, was a quasi-permanent extension of his body, rarely far from his side. He navigated the world with a quiet but profound confidence, his artistic eye possessing the rare ability to find beauty, intrigue, and narrative in the most mundane corners of their small, isolated town. He was a documentarian of his time and place, his stark black and white photographs telling stories of quiet dignity, hidden struggles, and the resilient spirit of their predominantly black community. His portfolio was already a testament to a precocious, undeniable talent. He harbored well-defined dreams of art school in New York City, of a life that extended beyond a familiar topography of fields and forests that demarcated their county line. His intense focus that afternoon, a meditative state he entered whenever he worked, was abruptly shattered by a knock on the kitchen door. It was their neighbor, Mr. Theodore Ted Gaines. Gaines was a widower in his mid-50s, a reclusive figure who had inhabited the house next door for as long as Damien could remember. He was a fixture of the local landscape, regarded by the community as harmlessly eccentric, a quiet man who kept to himself. His large, unkempt property, a wilderness of overgrown grass and encroaching woods, stood in stark, silent contrast to the neatly tended yards of his neighbors. Its most notable feature was an old, dilapidated sheep pen languishing at the back of the lot, a skeletal, rotting structure that hadn't sheltered an animal in decades. "Afternoon, Damien," Mr. Gaines said. His voice was a soft, slightly reedy instrument, a sound that seemed at odds with his physical presence. Though not a large man, he had a sturdy, farmer's build, and his hands, which he now wiped on his overalls, were thick and calloused, knuckles like knots on a rope. He held a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its painted feathers faded by time. "I was wondering if you might could give me a hand." A substantial branch came down near my fence line in that last bit of wind, and it's a bit too heavy for an old man to move on his own. Damien, ever polite and conditioned by a culture of respect for his elders, readily agreed without a second thought. "Of course, Mr. Gaines. Just let me finish rinsing this print and put things away. Won't be long." "No rush, son," Gaines said, his pale eyes lingering on Damien's camera, which sat on the kitchen table. "That's a fine piece of equipment you got there. A real professional's tool." 20 minutes later, Damien had carefully washed the last chemical traces from his hands and walked across the dry, crackling leaves that separated the two properties. He followed Gaines past the quiet, slightly shabby house, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin, and towards the back of the lot, where the property line dissolved into a dense thicket of woods. The old sheep pen stood there, its wood a silvery, weathered gray, its roof sagging like a weary spine. "It's just past here," Gaines said, gesturing vaguely toward the trees. But then he paused, turning to Damien with a conspiratorial twinkle in his eye, a sudden shift in demeanor that was both intriguing and faintly unsettling. "You know, son, you being a photographer and all, there's something in that old pen I bet you'd find mighty interesting. Something no one's laid eyes on in 50 years. Damien's curiosity, the professional instinct of a visual storyteller, was immediately piqued. He was perpetually on the hunt for unique subjects, for the strange and forgotten artifacts that populated the rural South. Really? What is it? Easier to show you than tell you, Gaines replied, his lips curling into a thin, knowing smile. He led him towards a sheep pen. The door groaned open on oxidized, protesting hinges, revealing a dark, dusty interior that smelled of old hay, decay, and damp, packed earth. It's in the back, under a loose floorboard, an old family relic tucked away for safekeeping. Damien, his mind already composing the shot, the play of light and shadow, the texture of the old wood, the mystery of the hidden object, saw no harm in his quiet, elderly neighbor. He was a known quantity, a harmless eccentric. He stepped inside, his eyes struggling to adjust. The light from the open doorway barely penetrated the gloom. He followed Gaines to the back of the small, cramped structure. Gaines knelt, his movements surprisingly spry and fluid for his age, and with practiced ease, he pried up a section of the floor, revealing a dark, square aperture. "Down there," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Just a small cellar for keeping preserves cool. The relic's in an old lockbox." It was a trap, executed with chilling, patient simplicity. As Damien knelt, his camera bumping against his ribs, to peer into the Stygian darkness, Gaines moved behind him with the silence of a predator. Damien never saw the heavy, sand-filled bag that his neighbor swung with a sudden, vicious, perfectly aimed force. His world didn't just go dark. It exploded in a silent flash of white-hot pain. Then there was only a profound, bottomless blackness. When he awoke, it was to a complete and total sensory deprivation. He was suspended in a profound, disorienting darkness, the cloying smell of damp earth filling his lungs, his head throbbing with a calamitous agony. And then came the horrifying final sound, the heavy, solid thud of a trapdoor slamming shut above him, followed by the percussive, metallic scrape of heavy bolts being driven home. He was in a tomb, a secret cellar built not for preserves, but for a person, a prison designed not to kill, but to keep. The quiet, harmless Mr. Gaines, his neighbor, had been a monster hiding in plain sight, and Damien Cross, at 17, had just vanished from the face of the earth. The initial hours after Damien failed to come home were a slow-building storm of anxiety for the Cross family. His older sister, Cynthia, home from her classes at a nearby community college, expected him by dinner. When he wasn't there, she assumed, as she often did, that he was lost in his art, the scent of chemicals a more compelling companion than a family meal. She pictured him under the ruby glow, coaxing images from blank paper, oblivious to the passage of time. But as evening bled into a deep, starless night, and the strip of red light that should have been glowing under his darkroom door remained conspicuously dark, a cold, hard knot of fear began to form in the pit of her stomach. Their parents, their faces etched with a growing panic, began the ritual familiar to any family of a missing teenager. They called his friends, their voices tight with forced calm. No one had seen him since he'd left school. Cynthia, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, ran next door to Mr. Gaines's house. The lights were on, casting a warm, deceptive glow into the yard, but no one answered her frantic, repeated knocking. The silence from within the house felt heavy, unnatural. The next morning, a Saturday, after a sleepless night of calling every hospital and police precinct within a 50-mile radius, they officially reported him missing. The police investigation, when it finally commenced, was a case study in systemic indifference and ingrained prejudice. 2 deputies from the county sheriff's department arrived in a dusty patrol car, their slow, deliberate movements and weary expressions conveying a sense of bureaucratic obligation rather than urgent concern. They took the family statement on the front porch, their questions laced with a subtle, dismissive prejudice that was all too familiar to the black families in that rural corner of South Carolina. 17, you said, one of the deputies drawled, flipping his notepad shut with an air of finality. That's about the age they get restless, ain't it? Got a girlfriend? Maybe got a taste for the city life. My brother is not restless, Cynthia retorted, her voice sharp with a mixture of anger and raw fear. He is a dedicated artist. He has a full scholarship to the Pratt Institute in New York waiting for him. He has spent the last 3 years working for that. He would not just leave. Something has happened to him. The deputies eventually made their way next door to question Mr. Ted Gaines. He answered the door in his overalls, a picture of simple agrarian concern. He calmly, and with feigned reluctance, told the officers that yes, he had seen Damien the previous afternoon. Such a nice boy, Gaines said, his voice soft and slightly shaky, a masterful performance of elderly fragility. He came over, asked if I needed any help with yard work. I told him I was fine. Then he started talking, you know how kids get. Said he was scared. Scared of what? One deputy asked, leaning against the railing. Scared of failing, Gaines said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. All the talk about the big city, about this fancy art school. He said he was afraid he couldn't cut it. Afraid he'd disappoint everyone. He mentioned something about a girl, too. Some trouble there. Seemed real eager to get away from it all. To start over somewhere new where nobody knew him or expected anything from him. It was a perfect, poisonous, and utterly diabolical lie. It was custom-made for the deputies' preconceived notions, a narrative that allowed them to neatly categorize and dismiss the case. For them, the puzzle was already solved. A smart, ambitious black teen, buckling under the pressure of his own potential and some girl trouble, had simply bolted. It was a story they understood, a story that required no further effort. They didn't bother with a real search of Gaines's property. They cast a cursory glance at the dilapidated sheep pen and saw nothing but an eyesore, a testament to neglect. They never thought to question the story of the harmless old white man, whose tale so conveniently absolved them of any real investigative responsibility. The official narrative was set in stone. Damien Cross was a runaway. The police report reflected this, using phrases like voluntarily departed and no evidence of foul play. The case was, for all intents and purposes, closed before it had ever truly been opened. For Cynthia and her family, the weeks that followed were a descent into a living hell. They organized their own searches, rallying friends and church members. They combed the dense woods that bordered their properties, their desperate calls of Damien, swallowed by the indifferent trees and the vast, empty sky. They printed their own flyers, draining their savings at the local copy shop. Damien's handsome, smiling high school photo, a symbol of so much promise, was plastered on every lamppost, gas station pump, and storefront window in town. But their frantic efforts were met with the quiet, unyielding wall of official dismissal. The local paper ran one small story, a few paragraphs buried on page 6 between a farm report and a classified ad for a used tractor, framing it as the sad but common story of a likely runaway. Cynthia watched as Mr. Gaines tended his small garden, his back stooped as he pulled weeds. He would sometimes offer her a sad, sympathetic nod from across the fence line. The sheer, monstrous audacity of his deception, the horrific secret he was holding just a yard from their home, was a possibility so grotesque it was unimaginable. Yet, with no proof, with the police actively refusing to investigate any other possibility, her family's crushing grief was compounded by a profound, suffocating sense of injustice. They knew something terrible had happened, but the system, the only power that could uncover the truth, had already decided it wasn't a story worth uncovering. 27 years. It is a lifetime. In the world outside, beyond the confines of the Cross and Gaines properties, decades passed in a tumultuous blur of technological revolution and shifting cultural landscapes. Presidents came and went, wars were fought and forgotten, the Berlin Wall fell, the internet was born from a dial-up shriek and evolved into a global consciousness, and the 20th century gave way to the anxieties and wonders of the 21st. But in the hidden, soundproof cellar beneath Ted Gaines's rotting sheet pen, time had a different texture. It was not a linear progression, but a thick, stagnant, suffocating medium. It was measured not in years or seasons, but But in the grating sound of the meal slot opening in the heavy door, in the arbitrary cycles of dim, bare bulb light controlled from above, and in the slow, agonizing molecular erosion of a young man's soul, Damien Cross, abducted at 17, became a man of 44 in a concrete box 8 feet wide by 10 feet long. His world, once brimming with light and color and artistic possibility, shrank to the dimensions of his prison. His captor, Mr. Gaines, was his only human contact, a twisted, omnipotent figure who was at once his god and his jailer. Gaines would visit him, sometimes daily, bringing meager plates of food and canisters of water. Sometimes he would leave him in absolute silence and darkness for weeks, a psychological torture that frayed Damien's sanity. Gaines was not a physically violent captor in the traditional sense. He had broken Damien's body only once to capture it. His ongoing cruelty was far more insidious, more profoundly psychological. In his deranged mind, he was not a monster, but a protector, a savior. He would bring Damien books, old philosophy tomes, outdated encyclopedias, and newspapers yellowed with age. He would read articles aloud, carefully curating a narrative of the violent, fallen world outside, a world that would have chewed up and spit out a sensitive, artistic soul like Damien's. "You're safe here," Gaines would say, his voice a calm, reassuring poison that seeped into the cracks of Damien's broken spirit. "I'm keeping you safe. I'm protecting your gift from a world that doesn't deserve it." He allowed Damien to draw. He provided him with sketchbooks and pencils, a calculated act of magnanimity that served only his own perverse needs. When a sketchbook was full, Gaines would take it away. They were his trophies, a secret, private collection of the talent he had imprisoned. Damien's art, once a vibrant exploration of the world, became a harrowing record of his captivity. His early sketches were frantic, filled with attempts to map his prison, to document every crack in the concrete, every water stain. As years bled into years, the art transformed. He drew the face of his captor from memory, trying to capture the vacancy in his eyes. He drew his own hands, watching them grow older, thinner, the skin becoming papery. He drew feverish, surreal landscapes of a world he could no longer clearly remember. Sunlight filtering through trees, the face of his sister, the taste of rain. These memories faded into a distant, dreamlike haze, a story he wasn't sure was ever real. He lived in a state of profound, expertly engineered psychological manipulation, a ghost haunting his own life. Next door, Cynthia Cross lived in a different kind of prison, one made of memory, grief, and suffocating suspicion. The official narrative that Damien was a runaway had shattered her family. Her parents, broken by the public shame and the silent, gnawing agony of not knowing, passed away within a decade of his disappearance, their deaths hastened by heartbreak. Cynthia stayed in the family home, unable to leave. She became a solitary keeper of her brother's memory. The house a museum where his room was left untouched, his darkroom chemicals still stoppered in their bottles. She found a job as a high school art teacher, a way to stay connected to the passion Damien had been forced to abandon, a penance and a tribute all in one. She never stopped watching Ted Gaines. For 27 years, he was the focal point of her quiet, obsessive orbit. She saw him grow from a reclusive man in his 50s into a frail, solitary old man in his 80s. She observed him as the rest of the community did, a harmless, eccentric widower who kept to himself. But a deep, primal instinct, a sister's intuition that she could never rationalize or shake, told her he was the epicenter of the silence that had swallowed her brother. There was a darkness in his quietness, a weight in the way he sometimes looked at her from his porch, a fleeting shadow of something proprietary and malevolent in his gaze. But she had no proof, just a gut-wrenching, sanity-shredding suspicion that often felt like a form of madness. She began to keep a journal, documenting every small, strange thing she could observe. The odd hours he kept, the large bags of groceries for a man who lived alone, the days he spent reinforcing the old sheet pen for no discernible reason. It was a 27-year chronicle of a monster hiding in plain sight, a meticulous study of the banal evil next door. She watched as his property fell further into decay, the sheep pen slowly surrendering to weeds and rot, becoming one with the landscape, its terrible secret held safe by its own dereliction. She saw his health begin to fail, saw the visiting nurses start to arrive, their sedans pulling into his overgrown driveway. A new kind of panic began to set in. She knew time was running out. Whatever secret Ted Gaines held, he was about to take it with him to the grave, and Damien would be lost forever, a ghost not just to the world, but to the truth itself. In the early, rain-soaked spring of 2013, the inevitable finally happened. Theodore Ted Gaines, now 82 and ravaged by a vascular dementia that had eroded the last vestiges of his coherence and memory, was permanently moved into a full-time state nursing facility. His house and the overgrown, 2-acre property it sat on, after being seized by the county for years of unpaid back taxes, were put up for public auction. For 27 years, the property had been a dark, silent, watchful neighbor to Cynthia Cross. Now, it was about to give up its secrets. The property was purchased by the Miller family, a young, energetic couple with 2 small children, fleeing the congestion of Charlotte for a quieter, more pastoral life. They saw not a place of secrets and decay, but a blank canvas for their dreams, a place to build a new home, to plant an organic garden, to raise their family under a sky unobscured by skyscrapers. They knew nothing of the property's chilling proximity to one of the town's oldest, coldest tragedies. Their first order of business was to clear the blighted land. They hired a small local demolition crew to tear down the dilapidated outbuildings, the most prominent and unsightly of which was the old, rotting sheep pen at the back of the property, its silhouette stark against the woods. On a bright, cool April morning, the demolition began. The crew, armed with pry bars, sledgehammers, and a healthy dose of get-it-done attitude, started dismantling the skeletal structure. The wood was so rotted it came apart with a soft, punky sound, crumbling into dust and splinters. As they pulled up the damp, warped floorboards to get to the foundation, one of the workers, a young man named Jake, noticed something was wrong. Beneath the rotten planks was not just packed earth, but another layer of heavy, thick wood. "Hey, boss," Jake called out to the crew chief, his voice muffled by the dust. "We got something here. There's a subfloor. Looks like some kind of trapdoor." The crew gathered around, their curiosity piqued. It was indeed a heavy trapdoor, its edges cleverly disguised, its surface nearly flush with the hidden foundation. It was swollen with decades of damp, and held shut by heavy, rusted iron bolts that had been driven home from the outside. It took 2 men with heavy crowbars, their muscles straining against the rusted metal, to finally pry it open. With a groan of tortured wood and a final, sharp crack of splintering timber, the trapdoor gave way, revealing a dark, square opening into the earth below. A wave of cool, foul air, thick with the smell of mildew, human waste, and a profound, suffocating stillness washed over them. The men recoiled, coughing and covering their mouths. Jake, the youngest and most curious, grabbed a powerful flashlight from their truck and shone its beam into the darkness. The light cut through the gloom, illuminating a small, concrete-lined cellar. It was unmistakably a prison. A single cot with a filthy, flattened mattress. A bucket in the corner. Shelves holding a few dented cans of food and plastic water jugs. And on the far wall, a cascade of frantic, desperate markings scratched into the concrete. They were tally marks. Thousands upon thousands of them, arranged in neat, obsessive rows, a silent, heartbreaking calendar of lost days, weeks, and years. This was not a storm cellar. This was a cage, and it didn't look abandoned. It looked as if it had been occupied until very, very recently. The crew chief, a grizzled man with 3 decades of demolition experience, felt his blood run cold. His face went pale. He knew immediately what they had found was beyond their comprehension. "Nobody touches anything," he said, his voice a hoarse, urgent whisper. "Shut it down. Somebody call the sheriff. Now." The call to the county sheriff's department about a hidden room found under an old sheep pen landed on the desk of Detective Julian Reed. Reed, a seasoned investigator in his late 40s with a hard-earned reputation for his methodical work on cold cases, felt a prickle of professional intuition. He was old enough to remember the whispers about the crossboy. He pulled the old, thin file on the 1986 disappearance of Damian Cross, the 17-year-old artist who had vanished from the property directly next door. When Detective Reed arrived at the scene, the air was already thick with a grim, unspoken understanding. He met Cynthia Cross there. She had come over, her heart pounding a deafening drum against her ribs, as soon as she saw the official police cars parked next door. Reed, his face a mask of compassion, gently led her to the sheep pen, to the open maw of the trapdoor. She peered down into the darkness at the thousands of tally marks on the wall, and a strangled, guttural sob escaped her, a sound of 27 years of repressed agony. All that time wondering, suspecting her quiet, strange neighbor, being dismissed as a grieving sister who couldn't let go. And the truth, the horrifying, unimaginable truth, had been here, just yards from her childhood bedroom, all along. The cellar was empty. Damian was not there. The discovery was both a vindication and a fresh, new form of torture. But the trapdoor and the prison it concealed was the first real clue in his disappearance in 27 years. The hunt for Damian Cross, a hunt that had been abandoned by the system in 1986, was finally, horrifyingly, beginning again. The discovery of the hidden cellar transformed a 27-year-old cold case into a frantic, high-stakes investigation. The primary question that had haunted Cynthia Cross for her entire adult life, what happened to Damian, was now eclipsed by a new, even more urgent one. Is he still alive? Detective Julian Reed's investigation focused with singular intensity on one man, Theodore Ted Gaines. Gaines, now 82 and residing in the secure wing of a nearby state-run nursing facility, his mind a foggy, impenetrable landscape of dementia, was the sole keeper of the truth. The race was on to extract any possible information from his deteriorating memory before it was lost to the disease forever. The interviews were a maddening, heartbreaking exercise in futility. Gaines would sit in his wheelchair, his eyes vacant, offering only fragmented, nonsensical phrases about the weather or the food. But sometimes, when shown a photograph of the young, vibrant Damian from 1986, a flicker of something, recognition, anger, a possessive glint, would pass through his clouded gaze. During one interview, he clutched Damian's photo to his chest and whispered, "My boy's safe." I kept him safe. It was a chilling, delusional confession that offered no practical clues as to Damian's current whereabouts. While the interviews with Gaines hit a dead end, the forensic team meticulously processed the hidden cellar. It was a place of profound psychological horror. They found Damian's initials, DC, scratched into the underside of the wooden cot. They found stacks upon stacks of old sketchbooks, filled with haunting, surreal images drawn in the dim light of a single bare bulb, a visual diary of a mind under siege. But there were no definitive recent signs of life, no fingerprints other than Damian's and Gaines's. The place felt like a stage from which the actors had recently and violently departed. The suspense became almost unbearable for Cynthia. The discovery of the cellar was proof of a monstrous crime, but the absence of her brother was a new kind of torture. Where had Gaines taken him? Had he, in a final, lucid act of cruelty before being moved to the nursing home, sealed Damian in an even more remote, more permanent tomb? The breakthrough, when it came, was a message from a ghost, sent across a divide of 27 years. At the bottom of a wooden crate filled with damp, musty books, the forensics team found it, Damian's old 35mm camera. It had been meticulously wrapped in a thick, waxed oilcloth, the folds sealed with what looked like melted candle wax. A desperate, makeshift attempt at waterproofing. Detective Reed handled the bundle with reverence. It wasn't just an old camera, it was a time capsule, deliberately prepared. The heavy, mechanical body of the camera, a Pentax K1000 built like a small metal tank, a product of an era before fragile electronics, had been shielded from the worst of the cellar's corrosive dampness by its oily shroud. The real question was the film inside. Reed knew it was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. He sent the camera to the state police forensics lab with a personal request to expedite the process. The call he received a few days later from the head lab technician was tinged with professional disbelief. The technician explained the immense challenge. 27 years in a non-climate-controlled environment is typically a death sentence for delicate film emulsion. The film inside the canister was brittle and severely fogged from decades of ambient heat and natural background radiation. It was, he said, a 1 in a million shot. But two factors had worked in their favor. First, Damien had been shooting with a roll of Kodak Tri-X-Pan, a famously robust black and white film stock known for its stability. Second, the careful oilcloth wrapping had provided just enough of a barrier against the relentless humidity. Using techniques more common for recovering data from flight recorders, the team carefully extracted the film in total darkness. They couldn't use a standard development process. Instead, they used a specialized low-contrast chemical bath, coaxing the faint, latent images from the degraded silver halide crystals. The resulting negatives were ghostly, fragmented, and barely legible. But when they scanned them into a high-resolution digital system and began the painstaking process of enhancement, filtering out the noise and amplifying the faint signal of the original exposure, something miraculous emerged. The first 24 photos were a gallery of ghosts, exactly what Cynthia expected. Beautiful, poignant black and white images of their town, of their family, of Cynthia herself, captured through her brother's uniquely artistic eye. They were a heartbreaking glimpse of the life that had been stolen from him. But it was the final few frames on the roll that changed everything. The technicians called Reed immediately. The investigation had assumed the camera was taken during the abduction. The truth was more horrifying. Gaines had tossed the camera into the cellar with Damien, a cruel reminder of the world he could no longer see. The photos were taken after his capture. The second-to-last photograph was chaotic and blurry, an image of profound despair. It showed the concrete walls of the cellar, the single light bulb, the tally marks. Then came the final, horrifying photograph. Damien must have found the camera days or weeks into his ordeal. In a moment of desperate, lucid brilliance, he had staged a clue. Using the camera's timer, he had taken a picture of one of his own drawings. It was a frantic charcoal sketch from memory, a rendering of the interior of Ted Gaines's cluttered, dusty garage. In the center of the drawing, rendered with chilling detail, was a large, industrial-grade freezer, the kind used for storing game. The final frame, however, was what shattered them. It was not a photo. In a last, desperate act, Damien had opened the back of the camera, deliberately exposing the film to light. But before the light could completely obliterate the latent image, he had used a sharp object, a pin, a nail, perhaps a shard of rock, to scratch a single, frantic word into the delicate emulsion of the film itself. Freezer. It was a message from the abyss, a final desperate act of a 17-year-old boy, using the only language he had left to him, try to leave a map for a rescue he must have known would never come. It was a testament to his presence of mind and unbreakable spirit, even in the face of unimaginable terror. The word, combined with the photograph of the drawing, pointed the investigation in a new, horrific direction. Detective Reed immediately secured a new, more specific warrant for Ted Gaines's property. The target was no longer the cellar. It was the garage. Armed with the horrifying revelation from Damien's camera, Detective Julian Reed and his team descended upon the old Gaines property again. This time, their focus was singular and terrible, the garage. The structure was as dilapidated as the rest of the property, its wooden doors sagging on their rusted hinges, a foul smell of oil and decay emanating from within. Inside, it was a hoarder's labyrinth of old tools, rusted farm machinery, and decades of accumulated junk. And against the back wall, just as it had appeared in Damien's desperate drawing, sat the large, white, industrial-grade freezer. It was plugged into a heavy-duty extension cord, and it was humming quietly, still running. The air in the garage grew thick with a dreadful, silent anticipation. With Cynthia Cross waiting outside, flanked by paramedics, a silent, praying sentinel, the forensic team carefully cut the power to the freezer. They used bolt cutters on a heavy padlock Gaines had affixed to it. Then, with crowbars, they pried open the heavy, suction-sealed lid. A wave of frigid, stale air washed over them. Inside, huddled in the fetal position amidst bags of frozen vegetables and game, was a man. He was pale, his skin a translucent white, his body emaciated to the point of being skeletal. His hair and beard were long and matted and white. His eyes, when they fluttered open, were wide with a primal terror that had not dimmed in 27 years. He was 44 years old, but looked decades older, a man who had lived his entire adult life in a state of suspended animation, frozen in time. It was Damian Cross. He was alive. The rescue was a delicate, high-stakes operation. Damian was severely malnourished and dehydrated, suffering from extreme frostbite on his extremities, his muscles so atrophied he couldn't stand. But the deepest wounds were psychological. He was rushed to a specialized medical facility, the beginning of a long, arduous, and uncertain journey back to a world he no longer knew. The full, brutal truth of his captivity was slowly, painstakingly pieced together. As Gaines had grown older, frilier, and more paranoid about his secret being discovered after his death, his cruelty had evolved. In the weeks before he was moved to the nursing facility, he had conceived of a final, monstrous solution. He converted the large freezer, rigging the thermostat to a non-lethal but life-suspending temperature. He had transferred Damian there one last time, entombing him in a place of absolute sensory deprivation. He had intended for Damian to perish there slowly, a secret that would die with him, his body perfectly preserved for no one to ever find. Damian's survival was a 1 in a billion miracle, a testament to the resilience of the human body and the timely intervention of the demolition crew. Ted Gaines, his mind now a complete fog of dementia, was deemed mentally unfit to stand trial. He would live out his final days in a secure medical facility, the full scope of his monstrous crimes forever locked away behind his vacant eyes. There would be no courtroom confession, no legal reckoning, no satisfying justice for Cynthia and Damian. The reunion between sister and brother was the story's final, heartbreaking chapter. Cynthia sat by Damian's bedside in the quiet, sterile, sunlit room of the long-term care facility. The 17-year-old boy she had lost, the brilliant, laughing, artistic teenager full of dreams, was gone forever. In his place was a broken, profoundly traumatized man, a stranger with his brother's eyes. He was terrified of open spaces, of loud noises of human touch. He barely spoke, his voice a hoarse and used whisper. But sometimes, when Cynthia would sit with him, reading quietly, she would see a flicker of the boy he had been. One day, weeks into his recovery, she brought him a new sketchbook and a set of soft-leaded pencils. For a long time, he just stared at them, his hands trembling. Then, with an effort that seemed to take all his concentration, he picked one up. His movements were slow, uncertain, the muscle memory of his art buried under 27 years of trauma. He touched the pencil to the paper. He began to draw. A single, wavering line. Then another. It was the shape of a bird's wing. Cynthia watched, tears streaming down her face, tears not of joy, but of a complex, overwhelming sorrow and a sliver of defiant hope. It was not a happy ending. There could be no happy ending to such a story. It was not a miracle cure. Justice, in the way the world understood it, had been utterly denied. But in that small, quiet room, a different kind of victory was taking place. A victory over silence. A victory of survival. She had her brother back, not as he was, but as he was now. And her new life's work, she knew, would be to help him, day by day, line by painstaking line, learn to draw the world again. The tragedy was in his stolen life. But the triumph was in the single, defiant fact that, against all odds, he was still here to live it.